It's 6 p.m. on August 12, 2021, and the quiet residential streets of Keyham in Plymouth, England, are settling into a peaceful summer evening. Children play in front gardens while parents prepare dinner, and the sound of lawnmowers creates the familiar soundtrack of British suburban life. The temperature is a pleasant 20 degrees Celsius, perfect weather for families to spend time outdoors before the sun sets. In one modest council house on Biddick Drive, 22-year-old Jake Davison is having another heated argument with his mother, Maxine. To neighbours who might overhear raised voices, this would seem like typical family friction, the kind of disagreement that occurs in households everywhere when young adults struggle with independence and parents worry about their children's futures. But what the community doesn't know is that Jake has been developing increasingly dangerous beliefs about women, society, and his place in the world. His online activity has placed him deep within communities that promote hatred and violence, while his recent acquisition of a shotgun license has provided him with the means to transform his digital rage into real-world destruction. Keep this image of an ordinary summer evening in mind as we explore this story, because what happens in the next 6 minutes will shatter the peace of an entire community and expose the deadly consequences of untreated mental illness, combined with easy access to weapons and online radicalization. The case of Jake Davison represents not just a family tragedy that escalated into mass murder, but a systematic failure of multiple institutions designed to protect public safety. Jake Davison was born on the remote Shetland Islands in 1998, the third child of Maxine Davison and Mark Davison. The Shetlands, located off the northern coast of Scotland, represent one of the most isolated populated areas in the United Kingdom, a place where small communities depend on fishing and tourism while battling the harsh realities of island life. Mark Davison was well known throughout the islands, but not for positive reasons. He worked as a fisherman when employment was available, but he was better known as a heavy drinker and frequent fighter who seemed to attract trouble wherever he went. His antisocial behaviour and alcohol problems created constant tension in his relationship with Maxine. When Maxine became pregnant with Jake, the relationship was already deteriorating under the weight of Mark's destructive behaviour and the challenges of raising 2 children in an economically limited environment. Shortly after Jake's birth, Maxine made the difficult decision to leave the Shetlands and move to Plymouth, taking baby Jake with her but leaving his older siblings Zoe and Josh with their father. This separation would prove to have lasting psychological effects on Jake, who grew up feeling abandoned by half his family and disconnected from his cultural roots. The move to Plymouth was intended to provide better opportunities, but it also meant that Jake's early development occurred without the stability of extended family support systems. Think of Jake's early childhood like a building constructed on an unstable foundation. While the structure might appear solid from the outside, underlying weaknesses create conditions where any additional stress can cause catastrophic failure. Maxine settled in Keyham, a working-class area of Plymouth that had seen better economic days. As a single mother dependent on government assistance, she struggled to provide stability while dealing with her own trauma from the failed relationship and separation from her older children. By the time Jake reached school age, it was clear that he was developing differently from other children. He was extremely withdrawn and displayed concerning behavioural patterns that worried both his mother and his teachers. When family members visited from the Shetlands, they noted Jake's tendency towards sudden anger and his difficulty relating to other children. These early behavioural problems prompted Maxine to seek professional evaluation for Jake, leading to a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. While autism itself doesn't predispose individuals to violence, Jake's particular presentation included significant challenges with social interaction, emotional regulation, and adaptation to change. Maxine faced a difficult decision about Jake's education, whether to enroll him in a mainstream school where he might struggle socially, or place him in a specialised institution designed for children with learning difficulties. She ultimately chose Mount Tamar School, a facility that served children with special needs but was chronically underfunded and understaffed. The school environment did little to address Jake's underlying behavioural issues or help him develop healthy coping mechanisms for his social challenges. Instead of receiving targeted intervention for his emotional regulation problems, Jake learned to retreat further into isolation as his primary survival strategy. During his childhood and early teenage years, Jake's social world consisted primarily of his mother and occasional visits to the Shetlands to see extended family. While neighbours described him as generally polite and helpful, with tasks like grocery shopping, He showed no ability to form friendships or participate in normal childhood social development. This social isolation became more problematic as Jake entered adolescence, when peer relationships typically become crucial for identity formation and emotional development. Instead of learning to navigate the complexities of teenage social dynamics, Jake retreated into online environments where he could avoid face-to-face rejection, while feeding his growing resentment toward the world that seemed to exclude him. Jake's introduction to online communities initially seemed like a positive development, a way for someone with social anxiety to connect with others who shared his interests. He began participating in gaming forums, Reddit discussions, and YouTube content creation under the handle Professor Waffle. His early online content focused on gaming commentary and personal vlogs, where he discussed his struggles with confidence, dating, and social interaction. While his content was often self-deprecating and revealed deep insecurities, it initially seemed like normal teenage angst rather than dangerous radicalization. But Jake's online journey gradually led him into increasingly toxic communities that reinforced his worst thoughts about himself and society. He discovered Incel, involuntary celibate forums, where his sexual frustration and social rejection were reframed not as personal challenges to overcome, but as evidence of societal injustice against men like him. The Incel community provided Jake with a comprehensive worldview that explained all his problems through external factors. Women were shallow and materialistic, society was rigged against average men, and his suffering was caused by forces beyond his control, rather than issues he could address through personal development or professional help. This ideological framework is like a mental virus that replaces healthy coping mechanisms with toxic resentment. Instead of encouraging personal growth, therapy, or social skills development, incel communities promote the belief that their members are victims of an unjust system that can only be addressed through hatred or violence. Jake also became involved in black pill philosophy, an extreme branch of incel ideology that promotes complete hopelessness about the possibility of romantic success for men who aren't physically attractive. This belief system essentially argues that certain men are doomed to loneliness and should either accept permanent isolation or consider violence as their only form of power. By his late teens, Jake's online radicalization was beginning to manifest in real-world behavior that should have triggered serious intervention. In 2016, when he was 17 years old, he committed an unprovoked assault on a 25-year-old man and his pregnant girlfriend who were walking in his neighborhood. The attack was savage and seemingly random. Jake punched the man nearly 20 times, while the victim tried to protect his pregnant partner. When police were called, they issued Jake a warning but didn't pursue charges due to insufficient evidence, a decision that would prove to be a crucial missed opportunity for intervention. This incident revealed several important factors about Jake's psychological state. He was capable of extreme violence against strangers. He targeted a couple, reflecting his resentment about romantic relationships, and he showed no empathy for a pregnant woman who could have been seriously harmed by his actions. The failure to properly investigate and prosecute this assault meant that Jake faced no meaningful consequences for his violence, while also ensuring that the incident wouldn't appear on background checks that might have prevented him from later obtaining weapons. Think of this missed intervention like ignoring a small fire because it hasn't spread yet. What seems manageable in the moment can quickly become an uncontrollable disaster if left unaddressed. Jake's family members, particularly his father Mark, who had turned his life around after serving prison time, recognised that Jake needed mental health support and attempted to get him professional help through the NHS. But Britain's mental health services were overwhelmed, underfunded, and facing months-long waiting lists that made immediate intervention impossible. In June 2017, Jake applied for a firearms license to own a shotgun, a decision that should have raised immediate red flags given his history of unprovoked violence and documented mental health issues. The UK has relatively strict gun control laws that require applicants to demonstrate they pose no threat to public safety and have legitimate reasons for weapon ownership. Jake met neither of these criteria. He lived in an urban area with no agricultural needs, had no interest in clay pigeon shooting or hunting, and had a history of violence that should have disqualified him from weapon ownership. Yet somehow his application was approved in 2018. The approval of Jake's firearms license represents a catastrophic failure of the UK's gun control system. The officers responsible for evaluating his application either didn't conduct proper background checks or chose to ignore obvious warning signs that made him unsuitable for weapon ownership. Jake's acquisition of a pump-action shotgun provided him with the means to transform his online fantasies of violence into deadly reality. For someone already radicalized by incel ideology and convinced that society owed him something he would never receive, the weapon became both a symbol of power and a potential solution to his problems. The psychological impact of weapon ownership on someone with Jake's mindset cannot be understated. The gun provided him with a sense of control and potential for revenge that fed his delusions of being a wronged victim who deserved to strike back at an unjust world. As Jake entered his early 20s, his relationship with his mother Maxine deteriorated significantly due to his increasingly misogynistic views and nihilistic outlook on life. Their household became a battleground where Jake's resentment toward women in general focused specifically on the person who had sacrificed the most to support him. The financial pressures facing their household intensified when Jake turned 18 and Maxine lost eligibility for certain government benefits that had helped support them. Rather than recognizing his mother's struggles and stepping up to help support the family, Jake resented having to work and blamed Maxine for their financial difficulties. Jake found employment as a scaffolder, but he approached work with the same attitude he brought to everything else: resentment that he was being forced to participate in a system that he believed was unfair to him. Rather than viewing employment as an opportunity for independence and self-improvement, he saw it as further evidence of society's oppression. His online activity during this period revealed the depth of his hatred toward his mother and women in general. He posted extensively about how women were simple-minded, only interested in money and status, and incapable of appreciating men like him who were intellectually superior but physically unattractive. These posts revealed Jake's complete disconnection from reality about his own behavior and its impact on others. Instead of recognizing that his misogynistic attitudes and aggressive behavior made him unappealing to potential partners, he blamed women for being shallow and materialistic. Maxine became increasingly concerned about Jake's mental state and even contacted police to request welfare checks on her own son. She could see that his online activity and social isolation were pushing him towards something dangerous, but her attempts to get help were ignored by authorities who didn't understand the severity of the situation. Throughout 2020 and early 2021, Jake's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. He got into physical altercations with teenagers in his neighborhood that were serious enough to prompt police to temporarily revoke his gun license and confiscate his weapon. This revocation should have been permanent, given Jake's documented history of unprovoked violence and his obviously deteriorating mental state. Instead, police agreed to return his weapon if he completed an anger management course, a decision that demonstrated complete misunderstanding of the risks he posed. Jake's completion of the anger management course in no way addressed his underlying radicalization, misogyny, or potential for violence. The course was designed for people with normal anger management issues, not someone whose entire worldview was based on hatred and resentment towards society. The decision to return Jake's shotgun in July 2021 essentially provided him with the final component necessary to carry out the mass shooting he had been fantasizing about through his involvement in incel communities. Police officers who made this decision failed to recognize that they were handing a loaded weapon to someone whose online activity clearly indicated plans for violence. Jake's YouTube channel and social media posts from this period included explicit discussions of his admiration for mass shooters, his belief that violence was justified against a society that had rejected him, and his identification with fictional characters like the Terminator who pursue their missions regardless of obstacles or consequences. The failure to monitor Jake's social media activity or take his threats seriously represents a fundamental breakdown in threat assessment procedures. His online content provided a roadmap to his psychological state and violent intentions that should have been impossible for authorities to miss. In the days leading up to his attack, Jake's mental state reached a critical breaking point. His Reddit account was suspended for making inappropriate comments toward a 16-year-old girl, cutting off one of his primary sources of social interaction and validation from the incel community. This suspension triggered a cascade of rage and desperation that focused on all the people and institutions Jake blamed for his problems. At the top of his list was his mother, who had become the primary target for all his resentment about women, society, and his own failures. On the evening of August 12th, Jake and Maxine had another argument about his behavior and attitudes. The kind of confrontation that had become routine in their household but which Jake's deteriorating mental state could no longer tolerate. Rather than seeking help, taking space to cool down, or using any of the coping mechanisms he should have learned through mental health treatment, Jake made a decision that would destroy multiple families and traumatize an entire community. At approximately 6 p.m. on August the 12th, 2021, Jake's rage finally exploded into deadly violence. After arguing with his mother, he retrieved his shotgun from his room and returned to shoot Maxine at point-blank range, killing her instantly. The murder of his mother represented the breaking point where Jake's online fantasies of violence became deadly reality. Having crossed the line into homicide, he immediately understood that his life as he knew it was over, which freed him to pursue the kind of rampage that incel communities often glorify as the ultimate expression of their rage against society. Jake left his house armed with his shotgun and additional ammunition, entering the quiet residential street where families were enjoying a peaceful summer evening. His first target was 43-year-old Lee Martin, who was walking with his 3-year-old adopted daughter Sophie, pushing her toy pram along the sidewalk. When Lee saw Jake approaching with the shotgun, he instinctively tried to shield Sophie from harm, but Jake fired at both of them, killing Lee instantly and fatally wounding the little girl. The image of a father dying while trying to protect his toddler represents the ultimate innocence of Jake's victims and the complete absence of any justification for his actions. Jake continued through the neighbourhood, shooting at anyone he encountered. Ben Parsonage and his mother Michelle were both wounded but managed to reach safety. Stephen Washington, 59, was walking his 2 dogs when Jake shot and killed him in a local park. Kate Shepherd, 66, was having a cigarette outside a hair salon when Jake spotted her and shot her fatally. His final victim was chosen completely at random. She had no connection to Jake, his family, or any of the grievances that motivated his rampage. After 6 minutes of terror that claimed 5 lives and wounded others, Jake encountered a bystander who would later report that Jake said, "There's nothing to worry about, mate." He then turned the shotgun on himself and ended his life, bringing his rampage to a close just as armed police were arriving at the scene. The Plymouth shooting sent shockwaves throughout the UK and prompted immediate questions about how someone like Jake had been allowed to own a weapon, despite obvious warning signs and a history of violence. The investigation revealed multiple system failures that had enabled the tragedy. The firearms licensing officers who approved Jake's initial application and later returned his confiscated weapon were disciplined, but this accountability came too late to save the lives of his victims. The incident prompted changes to UK firearms licensing procedures, including requirements to investigate applicants' social media activity. However, these policy changes address only one aspect of the problem that enabled Jake's rampage. The underlying issues, inadequate mental health services, failure to take online radicalization seriously, and insufficient understanding of incel ideology's connection to real-world violence, remain largely unaddressed. Jake's victims included his 51-year-old mother Maxine, who had spent decades trying to help her troubled son, Lee Martin, who died protecting his daughter, 3-year-old Sophie Martin, whose life was ended before it could truly begin, Stephen Washington, a dog walker enjoying an evening stroll, and Kate Shepherd, a grandmother who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. These 5 people died not because of anything they had done wrong, but because multiple systems designed to protect public safety failed to recognize and address the threat that Jake posed. Their deaths represent the ultimate cost of treating online radicalization as harmless venting rather than genuine preparation for violence. Jake's involvement in incel communities represents a growing threat that law enforcement and mental health professionals are still learning to understand and address. These online spaces provide vulnerable young men with ideological frameworks that transform personal struggles into political grievances requiring violent solutions. The incel worldview promotes several beliefs that make violence more likely: that society is fundamentally unjust to certain men, that women are responsible for their suffering, that their problems cannot be solved through personal development or therapy, and that violence represents a legitimate form of protest against their circumstances. These communities also provide role models in the form of previous mass shooters who are celebrated as heroes rather than condemned as criminals. Jake specifically mentioned admiring other attackers who had targeted women and innocent bystanders as expressions of their rage against society. The psychological appeal of incel ideology lies in its promise to transform feelings of powerlessness and rejection into a sense of righteous victimhood. Instead of encouraging members to address their personal issues through healthy means, these communities reinforce their worst thoughts and provide justification for increasingly extreme beliefs and behaviours. Think of incel communities like cults that specialise in recruiting socially isolated young men and gradually convincing them that violence against innocent people is justified by their personal suffering. The process is gradual and often occurs over years, making it difficult for family members and authorities to recognise the danger until it's too late. Jake's case highlights the catastrophic consequences of Britain's underfunded and overwhelmed mental health services. Despite his family's efforts to get him professional help starting in 2017, he never received the intensive intervention he needed to address his psychological problems before they became dangerous. The long waiting lists, limited resources, and focus on crisis intervention rather than preventive care meant that Jake's deteriorating mental state was never properly addressed. By the time his behaviour became obviously dangerous, the window for effective intervention had already closed. Mental health professionals who might have worked with Jake could potentially have identified his radicalisation, addressed his misogynistic beliefs, and provided him with healthy coping mechanisms for his social anxiety and depression. Early intervention might have prevented his progression from isolated young man to radicalised terrorist. The failure to provide adequate mental health services represents a false economy where society pays far more for the consequences of untreated illness than it would have cost to provide proper care in the first place. Jake's case demonstrates how individual tragedies can result from systemic failures in public health infrastructure. Jake's radicalisation occurred primarily through online platforms that enabled him to connect with like-minded individuals and consume content that reinforced his most destructive thoughts. Social media companies and forum administrators failed to recognise the connection between certain types of content and real-world violence. The algorithms that govern content recommendation on platforms like YouTube and Reddit tend to push users toward increasingly extreme material, creating echo chambers where dangerous beliefs are reinforced rather than challenged. Jake's consumption of incel content likely became progressively more radical through this automated recommendation process. His YouTube channel provided a detailed record of his psychological deterioration and growing identification with violent ideologies, but no mechanism existed to flag this content for mental health, intervention, or law enforcement review. The warning signs were clearly visible to anyone who looked, but no one was looking. The challenge of monitoring online content for signs of potential violence remains largely unaddressed, even after multiple mass shootings have been preceded by extensive digital manifestos and warning signs posted on social media platforms. The Plymouth shooting demonstrates that preventing similar tragedies requires coordinated action across multiple systems. Mental health services, law enforcement, social media platforms, and community support networks all need to work together to identify and address threats before they become deadly. Mental health services need increased funding and reduced waiting times, so that people like Jake can receive help when they first recognise they need it, rather than after their problems have become unmanageable. Early intervention programs specifically designed to address radicalisation and misogynistic beliefs need to be developed and made widely available. Law enforcement agencies need better training in recognising online radicalisation and assessing the risk posed by individuals who consume extremist content. Firearms licensing procedures need to include comprehensive social media reviews and psychological evaluations that can identify potential threats. Social media platforms need to take greater responsibility for content that promotes violence against women or celebrates previous mass shooters. While free speech protections are important, platforms should be required to remove content that explicitly encourages violence or provides tactical information for potential attackers. Communities need education about recognizing warning signs of radicalization and clear pathways for reporting concerns about individuals who may be planning violence. Family members, friends, and neighbors are often the first to notice concerning changes in behavior, but they need to know how to respond effectively. Most importantly, society needs to address the underlying social and economic conditions that make young men vulnerable to radical ideologies. Social isolation, economic hopelessness, and lack of purpose create the psychological conditions where extremist beliefs can take root and flourish. While Jake Davison's mental health issues and social isolation help explain his progression toward violence, they do not excuse his decision to murder 5 innocent people, including his own mother. Mental illness affects millions of people who never harm others, and personal suffering never justifies taking the lives of blameless victims. Jake's case serves as a reminder that individuals retain moral responsibility for their choices even when those choices are influenced by psychological problems and social pressures. He had access to information about the harm his actions would cause, opportunities to seek help, and alternatives to violence at every step of his progression toward mass murder. The 5 people who died in Plymouth were simply living their lives, walking dogs, spending time with family, working, and enjoying a pleasant summer evening. They deserved to return home safely to their loved ones, not to become casualties in one man's war against a society that had never actually wronged him. Their families continue to live with the consequences of Jake's choices, while the community of Keyham remains forever changed by 6 minutes of violence that reflected years of failures by institutions that should have protected public safety. Jake Davison's story should inspire us to do better at recognizing and responding to the warning signs of radicalization before they lead to tragedy. His victim's memory deserves nothing less than a comprehensive commitment to preventing similar losses in the future through better mental health services, more effective threat assessment, and communities that refuse to ignore the signs when someone is progressing toward violence.